Yeah, you did a really good job in this. I thought of so all these books that are out there on Costello, I've read pretty much all of them, but
Yeah.
they all have these little snippets of his character, of little things that he did, and you
Uh,
wove like all of those
uh,
the coolest ones into this book, like just effortlessly, like the
oh, thank
being in the
you.
cab and the cabbie hearing his voice, and then down goes the flag,
Yeah.
and
Thank you.
there's a
Yeah.
bunch of them that are in here, but I thought it was neat that you did some of the stuff, like some of these stories that you hear, he'll be telling about him, but he'll like, it's not true. That's just something that I said because I thought it
Right.
was a good story. And I think,
Right.
90% of the stuff that we hear about him, that's exactly what it was. Like you
Well,
said, he's bolstering himself up, likes to talk about himself, and he wants to
and
be
and
imagined as a
he
certain
could
image.
he could be
So,
really charming when he wanted to be. I'm sure if you had dinner
yeah.
with him on, some fancy restaurant where he's picking up the bill, I'm sure he was a charm, and you could see he really wanted to be a legitimate person, and he's a fascinating character.
He
Fascinating
certainly was. Now, kind of talking about these guys, being liars and they're, how they are. But you wrote a really interesting article for the Daily Beast about the Godfather, and I think this kind of ties in really good with the kind of the legend of Frank Costello, because I think more than any probably gangster out there, there's this myth of the gentleman gangster, and how
Right.
he's a nice guy, and he was a mobster. He wasn't a nice guy.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to write about him sometimes without getting caught up in all that stuff and then making these fanciful stories about this guy.
Yes. Yes.
But tell us a
Yes.
little bit about the article you wrote.
Oh, so yeah, I wasn't arguing that The Godfather is not a great book, a great film. It's a great film. Has probably the best ensemble cast ever assembled in American film. Like, you got Robert Duvall, you got James Caan, you got Pacino, you got De Niro, you got Diane Keaton. I mean, it's one brilliant performance after another. And also, of all films, a friend of mine pointed out the historic. It looks like the period that it's writing about. In other words, all the details, the cars, the clothes, everything, it seems perfect, and it's brilliantly shot. Um, and obviously it's a classic. But watching part one, you think, okay, well, where's all the money come from? You don't see that. Well, you and I know where the money comes from. It comes from loan sharking, drug dealing, union, racketeering, and it comes from exploiting vulnerable people, right? Alex Cordes wrote a wonderful book called The Mob in the City. And he said, and he points out many, and that really colored the way I see um, the organized crime. And he said, they went into mom and pop stores, right? You don't see the mob moving into General Motors and say, we're going to take over. It was vulnerable, it was a garment industry in New York, which were all these small stores. It was, it was the docks where they could get in with the union, or they would take over a union. And it was, or the Fulton Fish Market, et cetera, et cetera. And also anything that had to garbage pickup, anything that had to move, and therefore was vulnerable to delays. The mob could exploit that weakness. Gay bars in New York City. Vito Genovese's family
Yeah.
controlled the Stonewall Inn, where the famous gay uprising took place, because it was a vulnerable population, right? Because if in the 50s, if you were a New York City school teacher and you're exposed as being a homosexual, you would lose your job. So the mob, sensed the vulnerability. Gay people couldn't congregate together. So they provided a way for them to do it, and they exploited the population. That's what the mob does. None of that is in The Godfather, right? Right. None of this is The Godfather. So it's this sort of myth of a family that protects you and doesn't rat on each other, right?
Yeah.
Well, we know that they all ratted on each other. Lucky Luciano ratted out a heroin dealer to the cops when he was a kid, and in Alex Cortes's book, he's destroying the myths of Omerta. And he goes, and he has a list of people who have testified, mobsters who have testified against the mob. Turn the page. Turn the page.
Yeah,
It's a
exactly.
long list. So,
Growing every day.
right. But so The Godfather perpetuated a lot of those myths, and also of how deeply powerful it was, and it was invulnerable. Well, it was vulnerable because where do all these people end up? They end up in jail, because if you look at, and if they end up in jail, they have heart disease because they worry so much, you know. Um, you know, what's his name? Meyer Lansky is an exception to that to some extent. He really, I think, served a month or two of time here and there. And I actually would recommend to anyone online watching Meyer Lansky being interviewed for Israeli television when he was trying to have Israeli citizenship. So he's interviewed by this Israeli interviewer, and every word he says is a lie, right? But he does it so consistently and so shamelessly. You almost have to admire, like, I don't know where these stories come from. It's a complete myth. And then even in Godfather 2, sort of Vito Corleone he's sort of a benevolent force, right? Within the Italian community in New York City, right? The Italian American community. They can't get justice from the government, so they have to turn to the Corleone family for justice. But people didn't turn to them for justice. They were committing injustices. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really seen in The Godfather. Now it's not a documentary, and they're not obliged to look at the mafia from one way or the other, but it creates a distorted view. Also, they're of history, and also they're seen as master strategists. Well, if they were master strategists, why did they all end up in jail? You know what I mean? If Lucky Luciano was a master strategist, why did he choose to testify in his own defense? And I put this in the book, when Tom Dewey just took him apart. If he hadn't testified, maybe he wouldn't have been convicted. But it was his vanity and his ego and his naivete about how well he came across that caused him to be convicted and end up in jail. And if Lucky Luciano was such a master strategist, why did he return to Cuba, right? And think that the United States government wouldn't do anything, that he could run the mafia, from 100 miles away in Havana. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah.
He knew
What is your opinion on the Costello and the drugs violence stance? Because he's always painted he didn't like drugs and he didn't do violence, but I mean, come on, how could he get to where he was without some violence? And if he wasn't directly involved in the drugs, I mean, he certainly knew about it, and there's nothing to stop it. I mean,
and then the question of, did he get a taste? You know what I mean? Like, did he, as the head of the family, was he getting a piece of everything? And certainly a huge part of what the mob did was, after the war, they brought heroin into the United States through East Harlem, and it had an absolutely horrible effect on the society, and it destroyed lives and all this. So could he have controlled it? Probably not. But did he know what was going on? I would think absolutely.
Yeah.
Did he profit from it, since members of his crime family were profiting from it? Probably. I don't think that he was, like John Gotti saying, do a hit on him, do a hit on him, do a hit on him. Was he responsible for a great deal of violence under his command, or particularly during Prohibition? Yeah.
You have to.
Yeah. They were firing weapons in the directions of people who wanted to stop them, the Coast Guard, hijackers, etc. So, when you fire weapons in the directions of people who are trying to stop you from doing something, it's bad things happen.